The streets of East St. Louis in the late 1990s told a familiar story: cracked sidewalks, abandoned buildings, and kids playing between chain-link fences. But for Tiffany Hall and Jamella Tunstall, these streets were more than just a backdrop. They were the beginning of something that would shape their lives forever. Tiffany first spotted Jamella in the cafeteria at Lincoln Middle School. Jamella sat alone, picking at her food, her backpack clutched close like it held everything she owned.
In a way, it did.
Moving from one foster home to another meant Jamella learned to pack light and keep her treasures close. That day, Tiffany walked over and sat down without asking. She pulled out a sandwich, split it in half, and pushed one piece across the table. No words needed. They were both 12 then, but their eyes carried the weight of kids who'd seen too much too soon. Tiffany's home life was a mess of screaming matches and slammed doors. Her mom worked 2 jobs and came home tired, angry, ready to fight about anything. Homework not done, dishes in the sink, Tiffany staying out too late. The walls in their apartment were thin enough that the neighbors knew their business, and Tiffany spent more time on the streets than at home. Jamella's story was different, but just as heavy. Foster parents came and went like seasons, some warm, others cold as winter. She'd learned not to unpack her bags completely, not to hang pictures on walls, not to get too comfortable. But something about Tiffany made her want to stay put, to risk putting down roots. They started spending every free moment together. After school, they'd walk to the corner store, scraping together change for snacks. They'd sit on the curb, sharing chips and dreams. Jamella would point her disposable camera at random things: a bird on a wire, sun hitting a puddle just right, Tiffany making funny faces. She had an eye for finding beauty in broken places. "I'm gonna be a real photographer someday," Jamella would say, showing Tiffany her latest shots. "Not just taking pictures of whatever. I want to show people how things really are." Tiffany nodded but rarely shared her own dreams. When Jamella pushed, she'd shrug and say, "Just want to get out of here." But getting out seemed like a fairy tale when you were stuck in East St. Louis with empty pockets and a reputation that followed you like a shadow. Life had other plans for both girls. By 16, they were pushing strollers instead of chasing dreams. Jamella's son Diane came first, a tiny bundle with his mama's bright eyes and determination. She'd show up to school tired but never missed a day, bouncing Diane on her knee while doing homework at Tiffany's kitchen table. Tiffany's baby girl arrived a few months later, but things went sideways fast. Rumors spread about bruises, about crying that wouldn't stop, about Tiffany losing her temper. Child services got involved, and suddenly Tiffany was watching her daughter through supervised visits, trying to prove she could be better. Through it all, their friendship held steady. They became each other's emergency contacts, backup babysitters, shoulder to cry on. When Jamella needed someone to watch Diane during job interviews, Tiffany was there. When Tiffany's mom kicked her out again, Jamella's couch was always free. By their mid-20s, their paths had started to split. Jamella had 3 kids now: Diane, Ivan, and little Janella, plus another one on the way. She'd lost custody for a bit after some trouble with Diane acting out in school, but she'd fought hard to get them back. Parenting classes, steady job, clean apartment, she checked every box and then some. Her photography dreams got packed away with her old camera, but she'd found new dreams in her kids' smiles. Tiffany's life looked different. She bounced between jobs and boyfriends, never settling, always one bad decision away from trouble. Her own kids lived with relatives most of the time, but she swore she'd get them back someday. The friendship between her and Jamella stretched thin sometimes, pulled by jealousy and unspoken words, but never broke. Or so Jamella thought. She couldn't see how Tiffany watched her with changing eyes, how friendship was twisting into something darker. Even when Tiffany's smile seemed off or her help came with strings attached, Jamella chose to trust. After all, they were sisters, not by blood, but by choice. Sometimes those bonds are stronger. Sometimes they're deadly. People in the neighborhood started crossing the street when they saw Tiffany coming. Not that she blamed them. Her reputation followed her like a bad smell. By 23, she'd racked up more drama than most people see in a lifetime. The kitchen fire she'd started at 14 was just the beginning, though she swore it was an accident. Then came the stolen credit cards, the fights at the corner store, the nights in county lockup. Her mom's house felt like a prison, with rules she couldn't follow and arguments that shook the windows. "Be home by 10, her mom would say, even though Tiffany was grown with kids of her own. But where else could she go? Jobs didn't stick. She'd worked at the Dollar General, the gas station, even tried waitressing at the diner. Something always went wrong. Someone would look at her funny, or the manager would get on her case, and next thing you know, she'd be walking out, middle fingers raised. The worst of it came in '99. Her baby girl was just 2 months old, all tiny fingers and soft breaths. Tiffany wasn't sleeping much. The baby cried all night, and nothing seemed to help. One morning, the neighbors heard screaming. Not the baby's usual fussy cries, but something different. When they peeked through their blinds, they saw Tiffany on the front steps, holding the baby like a sack of flour, limp and quiet. The hospital staff asked too many questions. How did she fall? Why didn't you bring her in sooner? Where are these other bruises from? Tiffany had answers for everything, but nobody seemed to believe her. Child services swooped in like vultures, and just like that, her daughter was gone, along with her other kids. The charges got dropped eventually, not enough evidence, they said. But the story stuck around, growing bigger with every retelling. Mothers at the playground would gather their children closer when she passed by. Even the tough guys, the ones who didn't scare easy, kept their distance. Meanwhile, across town, Jamela was building something real. After losing her kids temporarily, she turned her life around like it was nothing. Parenting classes? She was there early, taking notes. Home inspections? Her place was spotless. Every toy in its box, every surface shining. Even the social workers had to admit she was doing everything right. Tiffany would visit Jamela's apartment, watching how easily she handled everything. The kids actually listened when she spoke. No screaming, no threats needed. They'd pile onto the couch for movie nights, Deanne snuggled under one arm, Ivan and Janella fighting over who got to sit closest to Mama. Even the baby in her belly seemed to behave, not giving her too much trouble. The little green tractor in the yard was Diane's favorite toy. He'd ride it for hours, making engine noises while Jamela snapped pictures with her beat-up camera. She still talked about becoming a real photographer someday, but now it was just a someday dream, something to think about after the kids were grown. Watching all this, something started to twist inside Tiffany. She'd see Jamela's kids running to hug their mama when she picked them up from school, while her own kids lived with aunts and grandmas, barely knowing her face. She'd watch Jamela handle bills and groceries and school meetings like it was easy, while Tiffany could barely keep her phone turned on. The jealousy grew like a weed, choking out whatever friendship was left. When Jamela showed off her ultrasound pictures, excited about baby number 4, Tiffany smiled and said all the right things. But inside, she was counting Jamela's blessings, counting her own losses, counting the ways life had cheated her. That's when the plan started taking shape. At first, it was just daydreams. What if she had what Jamela had? What if she could prove to everyone she could be a good mother? What if she could start fresh with a new baby and do everything right this time? The thoughts got darker, more real. She started buying things, diapers, bottles, tiny clothes. She told her boyfriend Keith, away on Navy duty, that she was pregnant. The lie felt good on her tongue, sweet like candy. But a lie needs truth to feed it, and as her made-up due date got closer, Tiffany knew she'd have to do something to make it real. She watched Jamela more carefully now, noticing her patterns when she was alone, how she always left the back door unlocked because the lock stuck sometimes. Jamela, trusting as ever, never noticed the change in her friend's eyes, never saw how Tiffany's smile had turned hungry. The call came in on a muggy September morning. Tiffany's voice crackled over the police dispatch, hysterical, talking about a stillborn baby at Frank Holton Park. The responding officers found her sitting on a bench, clutching a bloody bundle to her chest. Her story came out in pieces between sobs. She'd gone into labor early, couldn't make it to the hospital, delivered the baby herself. But something had gone wrong. At the hospital, things didn't add up. Tiffany refused examinations, getting aggressive when nurses tried to check her. Her story kept changing. First it was a miscarriage, then she started talking about being attacked, about someone forcing themselves on her. The doctors exchanged worried glances. There were no signs she'd given birth at all. The same morning, across town, Jamella's apartment sat quiet. Too quiet. The school bus came and went, but Diane, Ivan, and Janella weren't on it. Jamella, 7 months pregnant and never one to miss her kid's bus stop, was nowhere to be seen. Her phone went straight to voicemail, unusual for a woman who always kept it charged and close, just in case the school needed to reach her. The neighbors noticed first. Mrs. Johnson from next door knew something was wrong when she didn't hear the usual morning chaos. No kids arguing over bathroom time. No Jamella calling out reminders about homework and lunches. The little green tractor sat abandoned in the yard, collecting dew. By afternoon, worry had spread through the community like wildfire. Jamella's sister tried the door, found it locked. Peering through windows showed an apartment frozen in time, dishes still in the sink from dinner, backpacks lined up by the door, ready for a school day that never started. She called the police, but they said it was too soon for a missing persons report. Adults had the right to disappear if they wanted to, but Jamella would never want to. Everyone knew that. Her kids were her world. She'd fought too hard to get them back, to just vanish with them. Meanwhile, Tiffany was planning a funeral. She'd named the baby Tiffany Horn, after herself and her boyfriend Keith. She ordered a tiny white casket, picked out flowers. But something was off about her behavior. She showed up hours late to her own baby's funeral, seemed distracted, kept checking her phone. Keith Horn had rushed home from Navy duty, devastated about losing the baby he thought was his. He held Tiffany while she cried, but her tears didn't seem quite right. They came and went too easily, like she was playing a part she'd rehearsed. When he asked questions about the pregnancy, about the birth, she got defensive, changed the subject. The community was living 2 stories at once, the strange saga of Tiffany's stillborn baby and the frightening silence from Jamella's apartment. Nobody connected the dots at first. Why would they? Tiffany and Jamella were friends, had been for years. Everyone had seen them together, sharing clothes and baby supplies, watching each other's kids. But as days passed, things started clicking into place. Someone remembered seeing Tiffany near Jamella's apartment the night before everything went quiet. Another neighbor mentioned hearing screams, but hadn't thought much of it. Screams weren't unusual in their neighborhood. The timing of Tiffany's supposed birth lined up too perfectly with Jamella's disappearance. The police started asking different questions now. Where exactly in the park had Tiffany given birth? Why hadn't she called an ambulance instead of delivering alone? How had she cut the umbilical cord? Each question made her story wobble more, like a house of cards in the wind. Keith started noticing things too. The pregnancy photos Tiffany had sent him while he was away, something about them seemed wrong now. The dates didn't match up. The belly looked different in each picture, like she'd stuffed it with different things. When he tried to talk to her about it, she flew into a rage, accused him of not trusting her, of not loving their dead baby. The truth was scratching at the surface, trying to break through. But nobody wanted to believe what their gut was telling them. Not yet. Sometimes the truth is too ugly to look it straight on. You have to come at it sideways, piece by piece, until there's no choice but to see the whole horrible picture. 6 days after Jamella vanished, Officer Martinez walked through waist-high weeds in a vacant lot near Tiffany's house. Tips had been coming in, each one leading nowhere, until someone mentioned seeing Tiffany dragging something heavy through these weeds late at night. The September heat had baked the ground hard, but there were still traces, broken stems, a path pressed into the dirt. The smell hit them first. Sweet and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. They found Jamella wrapped in a shower curtain, the plastic clouded with dried blood. The medical examiner would later piece together her final moments. The first blow to the head with a wooden table leg, hard enough to stun but not kill. The duct tape around her wrists and ankles, the gag in her mouth. She'd been alive when Tiffany cut into her, alive when her baby was taken. The scissors lay nearby, rusted with blood. They were kitchen scissors, the kind you'd use to cut chicken, now used for something unthinkable. The ground around Jamella's body was soaked dark, telling a story of a death that came slow and painful. The medical examiner found defensive wounds on her hands, proof she'd fought until the end. The news spread through East St. Louis like poison. People gathered behind the police tape, holding each other, crying, praying. Some had known Jamila since she was a girl, watched her grow up, seen her fight to make something of herself. Now they watched as the coroner's Ben took her away, her dreams of becoming a photographer, of raising her children, wrapped up in that same bloody shower curtain. That night, the police picked up Tiffany at her mother's house. She didn't run, didn't fight. She sat at the kitchen table, calm as Sunday morning, drinking coffee while they put the cuffs on. At the station, she talked. And talked. And talked. Like she'd been waiting to tell this story, proud of how she'd planned it all. The details spilled out of her like she was describing a movie she'd watched, not murders she'd committed. She'd invited Jamila over, saying she needed help setting up the nursery for her fake baby. Jamila, always ready to help, never saw the table leg coming. The duct tape was already cut into strips, laid out neat and ready. The scissors were sharp, cleaned specially for their horrible purpose. The baby, a little boy, had died during the crude C-section. Tiffany described trying to save it like she was the victim in all this. She'd wrapped it in a blanket, taken it to the park, called the police with her story about a stillbirth. The funeral she'd arranged wasn't for a baby that had never existed. It was for Jamila's son, who never got a chance to breathe. The investigators had seen a lot in their careers, but this shook them. The level of planning, the betrayal of a friendship that went back years, the calm way Tiffany described everything. It was like something from a horror movie. But horror movies end. This was real, and it wasn't over. Because there was still the question nobody wanted to ask. Where were Jamila's other children? Tiffany's face changed when they brought it up. Something flickered behind her eyes, like a candle going out. She stared at the wall, picked at her nails, asked for more coffee. The detectives pressed harder. The kids hadn't been seen in 6 days. Where were they? The answer wouldn't come that night. It would take another day of searching, another piece of this nightmare to uncover. The community held on to hope, organized search parties, printed flyers with 3 smiling faces, Dan with his missing front tooth, Ivan clutching his favorite action figure, little Janella with her beaded braids. They wanted to believe the kids were somewhere safe, that at least they had been spared. But hope is a fragile thing, easily broken. And in East St. Louis, people had learned the hard way that sometimes the worst thing you can imagine isn't even close to the truth. The search for Jamila's kids led police back to her apartment. Standing in the parking lot, Detective Wilson noticed something off about the building's silence. Usually, apartment complexes had some kind of life, TV sounds, people arguing, kids playing. But this one felt dead, like even the walls were holding their breath. The smell hit them at the door. In September heat, with no AC running for days, the apartment had turned into an oven. They found the first signs in the bathroom, water stains on the floor, towels piled in corners, a rubber duck floating in pink-tinged water. The tub told a story nobody wanted to read. But it was the laundry room that held the real horror. The washing machine stood quiet, its white surface clean and ordinary. Opening it revealed what nightmares are made of. Diane, 12 years old, who just started middle school, who loved his green tractor and wanted to be a scientist. His body curled up like he was sleeping. The dryer held Ivan and Janella. Ivan, 9 years old, still clutching the action figure he'd taken everywhere. Janella, just 6, her beaded braids tangled, the pink dress she'd picked for the first day of school now stained dark. All 3 kids, naked, like Tiffany had stripped away their dignity along with their clothes. The crime scene techs worked in shifts, taking breaks to cry or throw up or just stare at nothing. They'd seen dead bodies before. This was East St. Louis, after all. But kids were different. Kids hidden in appliances by someone they trusted, someone who'd watched them grow up, someone who'd pretended to love them. Back at the station, Tiffany finally talked about the children. Her voice stayed flat, emotionless, like she was reading a shopping list. She'd done the kids first, she explained. Couldn't risk them making noise while she dealt with their mother. She'd called them into the bathroom one by one, telling them it was bath time. Dent fought the hardest. He was old enough to know something was wrong. But he was still just a kid, no match for an adult's strength. The details made hardened detectives flinch. She'd held them under, watching bubbles rise and pop until they stopped. Then she'd dried them off, almost tenderly, before hiding them in the washer and dryer. The whole thing took less than an hour. After that, she'd cleaned up, waited for Jamila to come over, finished her plan. When asked why she didn't use the washer and dryer at her own place, Tiffany said she wanted Jamila to take the blame. She thought the police would find the bodies and assume Jamila had killed her own kids before running away. The plan might have worked, too, if she hadn't gotten greedy, if she hadn't tried to steal Jamila's unborn baby. The community reeled as each detail emerged. Parents held their children closer, checked their doors twice at night, looked at old friends with new suspicion. The apartment complex stayed empty for weeks. Nobody wanted to live where those kids had died. Their toys sat untouched in the yard, the little green tractor rusting in the rain. The medical examiner worked carefully, respectfully, documenting every mark, every bruise. The children had died quickly. At least, small mercy in a story with none. They'd been killed just hours before their mother, probably while she was at the store buying supplies for the baby's room, never knowing she was shopping for her own murder. In death, the kids looked peaceful, like they were just sleeping. The coroner wrapped them in clean blankets instead of body bags. They'd had enough indignity in those appliances. When the funeral home came, they brought 3 small caskets, white like the one Tiffany had bought for Jamila's unborn son. But this time, the bodies inside were real, and so was the grief that followed them. Tiffany's confession painted a picture of calculated evil that left even veteran detectives shaken. She'd been planning it for weeks, maybe months. The pregnancy lie started as a way to keep Keith from leaving. He'd been talking about breaking up, tired of her drama. A fake belly, some borrowed ultrasound photos, and suddenly he was excited about being a dad. But lies need feeding, and this one got hungry. She started watching Jamila differently, eyeing her growing belly with something between envy and hunger. Jamila's life seemed so perfect, the kids who adored her, the clean apartment, the way everyone in the neighborhood respected her. Tiffany wanted that life, thought maybe she could steal it piece by piece. The supplies came first, duct tape bought at different stores so nobody would notice, scissors sharp and special, a shower curtain to wrap the body in. She'd watched medical shows, learned where to cut, thought she could do a C-section like it was nothing more than cutting open a package. The table leg she'd taken from an old desk, testing its weight, practicing her swing when nobody was around. The hardest part, she told detectives, was pretending everything was normal. Still hanging out with Jamila, still babysitting the kids, all while planning their deaths. She described it like planning a party. Every detail thought out, every step rehearsed. The kids had to go first, she explained, or they might make noise, might warn their mother. She picked the washer and dryer because they sealed tight, would keep the smell in for a while. Psychologists tried making sense of it, digging through Tiffany's past like archaeologists at a crime scene. They found the usual suspects: childhood trauma, abuse, a mother who switched between neglect and control. The kitchen fire at 14 wasn't an accident after all, but a reaction to being locked in her room for 3 days. The stolen credit cards, the fights, the problems with her own kids, all signs pointing to something broken inside. But plenty of people had rough lives without turning into monsters. The experts threw around terms like antisocial personality disorder, borderline features, possible psychopathy. They noted her lack of remorse, her ability to plan and execute such violence while maintaining a normal facade. The way she described the murders like she was talking about running errands chilled them. Keith, still reeling from learning his unborn child never existed, provided more pieces of the puzzle. Tiffany had been acting strange for months, more possessive than usual. She'd send him daily belly pictures, each one slightly different, now obviously faked. When he suggested waiting to have kids, she'd exploded, accused him of cheating, threatened to hurt herself. The community struggled to reconcile 2 versions of Tiffany, the troubled but familiar face they'd known for years, and the calculating killer who'd murdered 4 children and their mother. People remembered times she'd helped them out, watched their kids, shared what little she had. How do you make sense of kindness from hands that would later commit such horror? The house where it happened became a landmark of tragedy. People crossed the street to avoid walking past it, whispered stories about hearing children crying at night. The little green tractor disappeared from the yard. Someone said they'd seen Tiffany's mother take it, though nobody knew why. Maybe as evidence, maybe as penance, maybe just to stop it from rusting there like a grave marker. The truth was simpler and uglier than any psychological explanation could make it. Tiffany saw something she wanted, a life, a family, respect, and decided to take it. She killed not in a moment of rage or madness, but through weeks of careful planning. The monster wasn't something that possessed her suddenly. It had been growing inside her all along, fed by envy and nurtured by a mind that saw other people's lives as things to be taken. The courtroom fell silent as Tiffany walked in, wearing an orange jumpsuit and chains that clinked with each step. She looked smaller than people remembered, almost fragile under the fluorescent lights. But her eyes stayed cold, scanning the crowd like she was shopping for groceries, not facing multiple murder charges. The evidence mounted day after day. Prosecutors showed the jury everything: the blood-stained scissors, the duct tape with skin cells from both Tiffany and Jamela, the table leg with Tiffany's fingerprints pressed into Jamela's blood. They played her confession video, where she described the murders between sips of coffee, like she was telling a slightly interesting story about her weekend. The defense tried arguing mental illness, brought in experts to talk about Tiffany's troubled past. They painted a picture of a broken woman, someone failed by the system, pushed to the edge by poverty and trauma. But the level of planning worked against them. The separate store receipts for murder supplies, the careful timing, the way she'd maintained her normal routine while hiding bodies and appliances, none of it suggested a mind too broken to know right from wrong. Keith testified about the fake pregnancy, his voice cracking as he described coming home for a funeral that turned out to be for someone else's murdered baby. He'd brought a tiny blue blanket, thinking they'd lost their child. Finding out the truth, that Tiffany had killed her best friend and stolen her unborn baby, broke something in him that would never heal. The victim impact statements brought the courtroom to its knees. Jamela's sister talked about finding Dan's homework in his backpack, math problems half finished, waiting for a tomorrow that never came. Ivan's teacher shared how he'd been saving his allowance to buy his mom a real camera, the money still in a jar under his bed. Janela's best friend, just 6 years old, asked the judge why her friend had to have a forever sleepover with angels. The worst came from Jamela's mother. She spoke about raising a daughter who never gave up, who fought her way back from every setback, who loved her children fierce and full. She described the day Jamela got her kids back from foster care, how she'd transformed her apartment into a home, taken every parenting class she could find, worked double shifts to give her kids what they needed. Now all that love, all that effort, lay buried in 4 caskets because someone she trusted got jealous. The jury took 3 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts, 4 counts of first-degree murder for the children, 1 for Jamela, 1 for the unborn baby. The judge took even less time with sentencing. Life in prison, no possibility of parole. When asked if she wanted to speak, Tiffany just shrugged. No apology, no explanation, no sign that any of it touched her. As deputies led her away, someone in the gallery shouted, "Why? They loved you. Why'd you do it?" Tiffany turned, and for a moment, something like a smile crossed her face. Then she was gone, leaving behind a courtroom full of people who would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand how someone could betray love so completely. The prosecutors packed up their files, tucking away photos of 4 children who'd never grow up, a mother who'd never see them grow. The defense team quietly slipped out, carrying the weight of having tried to defend the indefensible. And in the empty courtroom, under the harsh lights, justice felt like a hollow word, a poor substitute for 5 heartbeats stopped too soon. Time moves differently in East St. Louis since the murders. People measure it in befores and afters. Before Tiffany showed them what evil could hide behind a friendly face, after they learned to doubt even decades-old friendships. The neighborhood changed, not in ways you could see from the outside, but in the small things. Parents stopped letting their kids play outside alone. Neighbors started asking questions when they heard arguing through walls. Trust, once given freely, became a precious thing, handed out in tiny pieces. Jamella's apartment building stood empty for months before they tore it down. Nobody wanted to live where those appliances had held such horrible secrets. They built a small park instead, with 5 cherry trees, one for each life lost. Every spring, when the trees bloom pink and white, people leave little things beneath them. A toy car under Diane's tree, action figures under Ivan's, hair ribbons under Janella's. Under Jamella's, they leave photographs, snapshots of everyday life, the kind she used to take. The 5th tree, smallest of all, blooms for the baby who never got a name. Sometimes Keith visits this one, though most people pretend not to notice. He married eventually, had kids of his own, but something in him stays broken. He named his first son after Diane, a tribute that makes people cry when they hear it. The tragedy changed how the community handled troubled kids. They started a program at Lincoln Middle School, where Tiffany and Jamella first met. It teaches kids about healthy friendships, about jealousy and anger, about asking for help before darkness takes root. They tell Jamella's story, not the horrible end, but the hopeful parts, how she fought for her kids, how she found beauty in hard places, how she trusted until the very end. Tiffany's story became a warning, taught in criminal justice classes and psychology seminars. Experts still debate what made her snap, why she chose such elaborate cruelty over simple violence. Her case files fill boxes, full of interviews and evaluations, each trying to understand how friendship turns to murder, how someone watches children grow up and then drowns them one by one. The funerals brought the city together like nothing before. 5 white caskets, the smallest one tucked between Jamella and her children. They buried them all together, the way they lived, a mother and her babies, even the one who never drew breath. The headstone reads simple, together in life, together in peace. Below it, someone keeps a small green tractor, replacing it whenever rust takes hold. Jamella's old camera turned up while they were cleaning out her apartment. The last roll of film showed normal days, kids playing, sunsets, silly faces. The very last picture was of Tiffany, smiling at something off camera, taken the day before the murders. The police kept it as evidence, but somebody made copies. One hangs in the detective's office, reminder that evil doesn't always wear a monster's face. Life goes on in East St. Louis, the way it has to. New kids play in the park where 5 trees grow tall and strong. New families move into old apartments, make new friends, trust new neighbors. But something changed in the city's heart that September. They learned that sometimes the worst monsters aren't strangers in dark alleys, but friends who sit at your table, watch your kids grow up, know exactly where you keep the spare key. Every year on the anniversary, people gather under those cherry trees. They share stories about Jamella and her kids, good stories, happy ones. About Diane's science projects, Ivan's comic books, Janella's dance recitals. About Jamella's dreams of becoming a photographer, her fight to make life better for her children. They remember not how they died, but how they lived. And in remembering, they keep a little bit of them alive, like flowers blooming in spring, like love stronger than betrayal, like hope that survives even the darkest nights.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.